Thanks for clicking play, welcome to the video. In this one I'm going to be playing with epoxy for my very first time and it goes horribly wrong. Normally I shoot my intro at the start and then figure things out as I go along and just see how it turns out. But this one turned out so bad I thought I'd come back and refilm the intro just so I could warn you. It might be interesting watching a beginner make multiple mistakes so that you can learn from them possibly. Basically I filmed so much it would have been a waste not to post it, so let's get into it. To get started, I bought a small kit of epoxy from Amazon for £10. I also bought this set of moulds just because it had a small square one that would fit this CPU. I put water into the mould, then tipped it back out into the measuring cup so I could work out how much epoxy I was going to need. I then poured way too much, stirred it with a terrible camera angle, placed my CPU in the mould, and began to pour my first epoxy thingy. I was super excited when it dried because it looked awesome, but once I pulled it out, I realised I'd made a huge error. Because I placed this CPU directly onto the mould, the epoxy couldn't make it to the middle, so I have this huge exposed gap which just looks horrible. So I poured some epoxy into the gap, poured some onto the bottom of the mould, dropped the two together, and then once it had set, there was loads of bubbles trapped in it, but it still looked cool, so I was happy. And this is going to be a keyring, so time to drill a hole. Started off as a really nice clean hole, then it hit the CPU. Because that was a lot tougher, it shifted the hole sideways. My next experiment was using epoxy to stick wood together, because if it works, this will help in the future if I do any more projects like the Plywood Game Boy. But because this video didn't go that smoothly, I ran out of time and didn't bother. Whilst doing this video, I have come up with some really interesting tests I want to try involving plywood and epoxy, but I'm going to have to dedicate a whole video to that in the future. For now, I'm just going to keep playing around with the epoxy, figuring out what does and doesn't work. Like these 50-year-old nails I found lying around in my basement. I pulled these out of some of the original woodwork in the house, and my house is close to 200 years old, maybe older. So, I'm filling up this coaster mould with water to figure out how much I'm going to need. But I underestimated how flexible it is and it spilled everywhere. So I used a cheese board to help get the right measurement of liquid. I started sanding the nails because they were covered in lumps and I wanted them to look flat. This was super boring. Luckily I survived the boredom, I grabbed my coaster mould and I started throwing the nails in. A quick mix of the A and B liquids. I'm actually using a fabric softener cap there to catch all the drips and spills. Poured it all the way around so it filled all the gaps it could, and when it came out it looked absolutely amazing. Because it's a liquid at first, it made the nails look black, which is super cool, but I was so excited I forgot that these take hours to dry properly. And I put it down on a piece of paper, and now that paper's bonded to it, so this piece is ruined if I can't fix it. I liked the computer processor test so much, I bought a batch of them. To hopefully make this one better, I'm doing a thin layer of epoxy and letting that dry on the bottom of the mould. Then I'm pouring some epoxy in to start with. I'm dropping the CPU flat side down, so hopefully there's no air bubbles. Then I'm covering the rest in epoxy and crossing my fingers. I also started filing one of the corners off, so when it comes to drill a hole for the keyring, it goes straight through. On to my next crazy idea, which was bicycle cogs. You gotta start by dismantling them, and some of them are a lot easier to take apart than others. Once they were in pieces, I had to clean every single one of them, so we ended up with this nice pile of shiny cogs. I wanted to pack as many pieces into each coaster as possible. That meant cutting some flat edges. I then poured a thin layer of epoxy in, dropped my first level of cogs, waited for that to set, dropped my second level of cogs, and I covered the rest in epoxy. I saw somewhere that tapping removes the bubbles, so I tried that. It didn't work. But it still turned out absolutely incredible. I'm going to list this on my Etsy store, and I'm actually going to make more of these because they're so awesome. And now it's time to play with colours! I know black's technically not a colour, but it looks cool. So in goes some black epoxy, then the CPU, then more black epoxy, and this one started moving around for some reason, so I had to put it in the right place. Whilst that's drying, we're going to test out a heat mat to see if we can remove some of the bubbles. I'm heating the mixed epoxy first, then I'm going to leave it on the heat pad whilst the whole thing's drying. I also added a few drops of blue to see how this one would turn out. More epoxy mix with the dye added straight into it, into a circle mould this time. then add a CPU, and wait for it to cook. Like everyone does, watched a few videos on YouTube, and heating things up was supposed to be the solution. But after heating mine up, it obviously wasn't. These are by far the worst tests I've done so far. So this one here looks like it had a giant bubble trapped underneath that just kind of grew, and it's actually expanded the plastic around where the bubble was. But as far as the colour test goes, adding a few drops to the stuff before I plonked it in, yeah, it's worked. It's given it a nice green hue, but there's too many bubbles. It's just terrible. This one, again, has a collection of bubbles which has just absolutely ruined this piece. I would say there isn't any bubbles underneath, but there's still a few around the edge. Apart from the giant bit in the middle which ruins it, this isn't actually that bad. But there's bits of the CPU that is actually poking out of the plastic. As for the colour test on this one, it looks kind of interesting the way the colour goes everywhere, but it's pretty difficult to control. In fact, there was no control on where the colour went. As both of these are ruined, I'm gonna do another experiment right now. After taking out my frustration on the epoxy, I decided to have another go at heating it, and it ended up with loads of bubbles in again, so I needed to come up with a different method. I'd also run out of epoxy, so a bigger, better kit was purchased. This time I put boiling water in a glass on the heat pad, and then I put my mixed epoxy in the boiling water to superheat it. After a couple of minutes you could see the bubbles disappearing, and when I went to pour it, it almost felt like water. It wasn't as gooey as it normally is. And this actually turned out loads better. To make these into actual keyrings, I bought the cheapest drill press adapter I could from Amazon. It was terrible. I genuinely nearly sent it back, but I'd already thrown out the box. This one had been drying for 2 whole days and the clamps still made a mark on the surface, so this one is ruined. But the hole I just drilled was really horrible as well. I think the drilled out plastic is spinning around on the top and scuffing the surface. So let's try again, being a little bit more careful. I put a piece of cardboard under the clamp, I did little bits at a time, I was removing the waste, and this one turned out perfect, apart from the huge bubble on the back. Rinse and repeat for the black one, and that's looking awesome as well. Apart from this weird blemish on the top. Now time to experiment with wood. I took a pallet block because they're useless, sanded it flat, chopped a slice off, sanded the rough side, and it didn't fit in the mould properly. So I snapped it into pieces because I thought that'd be interesting. We're using black again, then I just filled it with epoxy. It did look really cool, but there was loads of bubbles on the top side. The back side's going to need routering down, but for some reason this one started bowing. I'm wondering if that's something to do with the wood. This is my new router jig I've made for the next video, but it was very handy in getting these coasters flat. Once it was all routed down, it bowed even further, so this is another one ruined. Wood test number 2. I'm going to make use of these little circle offcuts you get from projects. First I started by sanding every single one of these down because they're kind of rough around the edges and I wanted them to look nice and smooth. This took forever, it was a horrible process, I wish I'd never done it, I'm sure there's a better way. But after many hours, the circles were all ready. But they were too tall, so I decided to try splitting them in half with a chisel. I was really fed up with this project, so I didn't care that one side was going to look hella ugly. Splitting them into pieces was really simple, went really quickly, and then I forgot to film the rest of it. So here's how this one turned out. When I was putting it in the epoxy, it kept on floating around, which was horrible, so it doesn't even look like the pattern that I came up with to start with. We're sticking with the little circles because I like making use of scrap wood. We're going to cut some little lines off these bits, layer them in a pattern, and hopefully this one goes well. This is going to be my last test with epoxy because this stuff takes forever to work with. I need to practice polishing this stuff till it's clear. So I've got this little heart thingy I've made here. I'm going to rough it up with some sandpaper and then I'm going to see if I can sand buff it back to being crystal clear again. Hopefully this one goes smoothly. Pun intended. I laid my sandpaper out and went 150, 180, 320, 400, but it was really boring doing it by hand. So we got electric. I needed higher grit wet and dry sandpaper, so I got some from Amazon and then applied some moisture. The first one was 600, then we went to 800 and it was already looking really smooth. Then 1200, 1500 and finishing off with 2000.
It's feeling super smooth, but it's not quite see-through yet, so we are supposed to buff it with some cutting paste. I don't know what that is, and I don't have it, and I don't like spending money. What I do have is Brasso, so let's see if this works. Nope, that didn't work.
I did find this turtle wax paint compound stuff, so I thought I'd give it a go. As you can see, it's sort of see-through, but it's not perfectly clear yet, so let's give this a go. It actually worked really well, but it's still not perfect, so let's try something else. That something else is Brasso again, in the furry version. After some rubbing, it did make it a bit better, but it's not as perfect as it was originally. But I'm totally fed up with this project, so it's good enough for now. I'll figure out how to make it better in the future. I actually saw a video where it said you can use toothpaste, so I really had to give that a go. This piece turned out so badly I didn't even put it in the video, but this is what we're going to experiment on. So a healthy application of the white stuff, some one-handed rubbing, which is not advised, and it turned out surprisingly well. I was so impressed with how good it was. And now it smells minty fresh too. So now the top side's looking alright, the bottom side's rough and horrible, so I decided to do another experiment. I just dropped a thin layer of epoxy on top of this to see if it would fill in all the blemishes. And apart from the bubbles, it turned out way better than expected again. Still not perfect, but hey ho. Next, I'm throwing the wooden pieces through my sanding process to see if there's any way of rescuing them. This one was looking alright, but like the other wooden one, it started to bow. So I clamped the super bowed one in between two pieces of wood. Then I added the slightly bowed wooden piece to this and waited for them to dry. After a couple of days, I unclamped it, and it was surprisingly flat again. So I dropped it back in the mould, and it actually looks like it shrunk somehow. I whipped up a batch of epoxy, and I couldn't be bothered adding the black this time. Then I realised I hadn't mixed enough, so I had to make more epoxy. Once it was completely full, I waited 24 hours, and when I pulled it out, I found somehow the epoxy had got underneath it and created this massive big void. It's just not going well. And out of nowhere, loads of patches of bubbles appeared on the surface. They definitely weren't there when I left it. But at least it's straight now. This project was stressing me out so much that I stopped filming there. I did actually make a few more pieces which kind of look cool. I also fixed a few of the other rubbish pieces so they look alright. And here they are right now.
Clouds are stirring up the sky. I was always in denial of what I saw right in front of me. And every time I'm so damn lost to what I loved and what I lost. But let's get lost in love tonight. Hear a second voice inside my head. It's telling me to say the night again. And hold on to the words we always said would be forever, forever. Wait another day to clear my thoughts. So jump into a love that won't be forgotten. Forever, forever. Let's run away together. Let's run away together. Let's run away together.
Alright, some of those pieces didn't actually turn out too bad. They weren't terrible, they are kind of quirky, so I'm going to be listing the majority of them on Etsy because I need money for tools and I'm not brave enough to go on OnlyFans. Thanks very much for watching, and thanks to the people who've been subscribing. It's kind of a pleasant surprise for me. I wasn't expecting that. But yeah, any tips, questions or suggestions, stick them in the comments below, and hopefully I should have a video out in the next 2 weeks because it's nearly done, but it'll probably go wrong and delay it as usual. Anyway, see you in the next one.